Her billionaire husband sent a driver for his mistress. She waited alone in the rain. The Level 0 transport alert on Sloan Vanguard's secure phone blinked red once, then replaced her name with Giselle Crofts. Not delayed, not rerouted, reassigned. Sloan stood beside the private tarmac gate, with the red routing flash drive sealed inside her coat pocket, while Julian Sterling watched from the terminal awning in a black executive suit. Inside the only bulletproof SUV assigned to emergency extraction, Giselle's white travel coat glowed beneath the cabin light as the driver loaded her luggage first. Sloan read the final line twice. Priority passenger updated by CEO authorization. Then she understood. This was not a storm problem. This was a hierarchy. Julian had protected his image before he protected the woman who built the system that protected everything he owned. She did not call his name. She looked at the SUV instead. The driver kept his eyes forward, ashamed but not powerful enough to refuse. Julian lifted one hand from under the awning, not quite an apology, not quite an order. Rain traced the sharp line of Sloane's red lipstick. Her coat was soaked at the shoulders, but her face stayed still. Julian had built an empire on visible control, black cars, private hangars, secured terminals. Sloane had built the invisible control. He owned the fleet. She knew its pulse. The SUV rolled forward. Giselle looked through the tinted window, one hand resting on her phone. Julian did not step into the rain. That answered everything. Sloane reached for the Level 0 badge clipped to her lapel. It carried her clearance, her access, her years of solving impossible failures before Julian's investors ever heard about them. She removed it slowly. No performance, no speech. The plastic bent once in her gloved hand, then split down the center. She dropped both halves into a shallow puddle beside the painted safety line. The red stripe across the badge blurred under the water. Then she moved. She turned away from the awning, away from Julian's protected silhouette, away from the SUV disappearing beyond the terminal lights. The storm pressed cold through the wool of her coat, but her mind had already left the tarmac. She opened her secure phone, disabled her personal emergency recovery channel, and sent one message to the offsite archive. Preserve all original routing authorship logs. Confirmation came. That was enough. At the service exit, the night shift gate attendant froze when he saw the broken badge missing from her coat. Sloane did not explain. Open the pedestrian gate, she said. He did. Beyond the fence, the road toward the commercial terminal stretched nearly half a mile through freezing rain. Sloane walked it without looking back. Halfway there, she slipped one hand into the inner lining of her coat and touched the red flash drive. The core routing algorithm was the reason Julian's ships arrived before competitors. He had mistaken quiet maintenance for obedience. Not anymore. Under the white glare of the service road lights, Sloane opened a private encryption app and entered the first command with steady fingers. Remove dependency permissions. The prompt asked. She confirmed. By the time the SUV reached Giselle's hotel entrance, Sloan Vanguard was no longer waiting for a ride. She was calculating what would happen when Julian Sterling's empire discovered its architect had walked out in the rain with the map. Sloan reached the commercial terminal, with rainwater running from the hem of her coat onto the rubber mat inside the entrance. Nobody recognized her there. That was useful. She paid cash for a black hoodie, pulled it over her soaked blouse, and sat at the far end of a freight dispatcher's waiting area. Her hands were cold. Her mind stayed clear. On the wall screen, a weather map showed the storm bending over the coast. Julian would call it extreme conditions by morning. Giselle would call it a beautiful rescue, if the angle flattered her. Sloane looked down at the rain-dark sleeve of her coat and saw the truth without decoration. She had built a system that never left cargo exposed. Refrigerated containers received priority. Medical shipments triggered immediate reroute. High-value electronics moved under guarded transfer. Even livestock had contingency shelter protocols because Sloane had written them that way. Then she understood the wound. She had protected everything he owned better than he had protected her. It landed quietly. No scene. No tears. Just a clean internal fracture beneath dignity. For 8 years, she had believed Julian respected the architecture even after the marriage cooled. But the SUV had answered the question. When he had to choose between the woman who kept his empire alive and the woman who made him look adored, he chose the photograph. Sloane closed her eyes once. Then she opened them. Enough. She unzipped the inner seam of her coat and removed the red routing flash drive. It was smaller than her thumb, sealed in a waterproof case, labeled only with a date and a black line. To Julian, it would have looked like backup. To Sloane, it was authorship, memory, proof, and leverage compressed into red plastic. She set it on the chair beside her and opened her secure phone. First, she checked the original commit history. Her credentials were still intact, but Julian's office had already filed a temporary access review. Predictable. She copied the timestamp. Then she downloaded the emergency extraction log, the CEO authorization record, the vehicle reassignment order, and the routing dependency map, showing how many live operations still leaned on her architecture. The number was obscene. That was his mistake. He had not replaced her. He had offended the only person who knew where the pressure valves were. A freight dispatcher glanced toward her when the printer released storm delay manifests, but Sloane kept her face lowered. She had spent years being visible only when Julian needed a miracle. Tonight, invisibility felt like a door. She drafted 3 messages. One to the offsite archive, preserve all authorship and dependency logs. One to a trusted compliance escrow account, hold pending review. One to herself, scheduled for 5 a.m. Begin independent maritime coordination filing. She sent it. Another executive car swept past without slowing. Sloane watched its taillights vanish and felt something inside her settle into a colder shape. Julian had not abandoned a wife in the rain. He had released an architect from a failing structure. She picked up the red flash drive, tucked it back into the hidden seam, and stood. There was a freight shuttle leaving for downtown in 11 minutes. She walked toward it with wet shoes, dry eyes, and the first clean plan of her new life. By 5 a.m., Sloane sat inside a secure business services suite downtown, behind frosted glass. Her clothes were still damp, but the red flash drive rested beside the keyboard like a small warning. She did not open Julian's system. She did not sabotage a single route. She did something colder. She documented what was hers. First came the authorship trail, model drafts, revisions, patch notes, port simulations, fuel cost layers, cold chain rules, and every routing decision Julian had once called too technical for the executive summary. She exported copies into neutral compliance escrow. Then she moved to the dependency map. That was where the empire exposed itself. Most of Sterling Maritime's live routing logic still leaned on her architecture, even after Julian's office told investors the company had institutionalized its operational intelligence. Sloane stared at the number. He had not built around her. He had built over her name. Not the same thing. At 6:12 a.m., the first call from Julian's office appeared on her phone. She let it pass. Sloane placed the phone face down. She pulled the vehicle reassignment order next, not because the car mattered most, but because it revealed the culture of the whole machine. CEO authorization. Priority passenger updated. Level 0 executive extraction downgraded without risk review. One careless favor had overwritten a crisis protocol. That was not romance. That was governance failure wearing cologne. Preserve that. She sent the transport log to compliance escrow and marked it for restricted release. Then she opened a blank folder titled Vanguard Maritime Coordination. Not a company yet. Not a press announcement. A foundation. By sunrise, she had outlined the first independent maritime data coordination model for ports that could not afford billionaire vanity in their supply chains. It would move cargo because weather, fuel, perishability, labor windows, port capacity, insurance exposure, and human safety all carried weight. No blindness. At 8:30 a.m., Julian Sterling walked into Sterling Maritime's executive crisis room in a black suit, expecting the room to obey his irritation. The operations director briefed him on storm reroutes and a Gulf Coast port window that required Sloane's predictive override. Julian waved one hand and asked why the team could not simply run the standard model. The room stilled. The standard model was Sloane. Julian did not know that, or he knew it, and had spent years refusing to let the knowledge become language. His fear had always lived there, the fear that the empire sounded like him, but thought like her. He called her work proprietary when investors asked. He called it collaborative when lawyers asked. He called it internal when Sloan asked for authorship protection. Different words, same erasure. At the suite, Sloan finished her filing checklist and paid for a private mailbox. She signed Sloan Vanguard, not Sloan Sterling, not Mrs. Sterling. Her hand did not shake. The work ahead would take months: filings, escrow review, port relationships, and a record clean enough to survive any hearing Julian tried to control. Good. She could wait accurately. Outside, downtown trucks moved, through the wet morning, following routes someone else would take for granted. Sloan stepped into the gray light, with the red flash drive in her coat, and one sentence at the top of her new charter. The system serves the route, not the ego. A man who treats his foundation like cargo will eventually watch his empire sink. Not all betrayals arrive with raised voices or public cruelty. Some arrive through policy, through a line item changed by authority, through a vehicle reassigned, because a man believes comfort is something he can distribute like status. The deeper insult is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is classification. Wife, worker, asset, backup, woman who will understand, woman who will wait, woman who will keep the system alive even after the system proves she was never protected by it. That is where arrogance miscalculates. It thinks silence means compliance. It thinks discipline means forgiveness. It thinks a woman who does not collapse has accepted the wound. But accuracy has its own temperature. It is colder than anger. By noon, Sloan had found the first room that belonged to no one but the work. It was not glamorous. That made it perfect. The space sat on the third floor of a converted freight brokerage building near the harbor, above a customs paperwork office, and across from a warehouse supply company that sold reflective vests, cargo straps, and industrial gloves by the dozen. The elevator smelled of cardboard dust and old machine oil. The windows faced a working channel, where tugboats moved beneath low clouds, and container cranes cut black angles against the pale sky. No chandeliers, no champagne, no borrowed applause, just movement. Sloan walked through the empty floor, with a leasing packet under one arm and the red flash drive inside her coat. The building manager unlocked the utility room and apologized for the exposed conduits, the unfinished ceiling, the hard floors, the lack of corporate polish. Sloan looked at the long walls, the power capacity, the fiber line marked in blue tape, the view of the harbor lanes, and the freight elevator wide enough for server racks. "This works," she said. The building manager blinked, as if expecting a complaint. Sloan asked for a 6-month operational clause, a server cooling inspection, after-hours access, and written permission to install maritime data displays along the west wall. Practical questions. Clean terms. By 2 p.m. she had placed calls to a port scheduling consultant, a retired cold chain compliance reviewer, and a maritime analyst, who had once told her, privately, that Sterling Maritime worked because Sloan could see failure before the fleet felt it. No names were needed, only competence. By 4 p.m, folding tables were delivered. By 5:30, 2 monitors were running live public port congestion feeds. By evening, the first map appeared on the wall: Atlantic routes, Gulf Coast delay corridors, West Coast unloading pressure, inland rail choke points, storm exposure, insurance heat zones. Sloan stood before it in the black hoodie, her red lipstick still precise, one hand on the edge of the table, and did not see revenge. She saw architecture. That mattered more. Revenge looks backward when it is weak. Strategy looks forward when it is mature. She opened her first independent operating model and stripped out every vanity dependency Julian had demanded over the years: executive priority movements, private aircraft preference, prestige client favoritism, routing choices made to impress investors instead of protect cargo. Delete the ego. Keep the intelligence. The new model asked different questions. What had to move first, because delay would cause human harm? What could wait without destroying value? Which port had capacity instead of social importance? Which route reduced exposure instead of flattering a client? At Sterling Maritime, Julian had called those questions background logic. In Sloan's room, they became doctrine. Near midnight, the maritime analyst arrived, with takeout coffee and a folder of public port reliability reports. The cold chain reviewer came 30 minutes later, carrying old inspection notes and a skeptical expression that softened only when Sloan showed the first simulation. Nobody asked about Julian. Nobody asked about the SUV. They looked at the model because the model deserved attention. Sloan plugged the red flash drive into an offline workstation and watched the directory open under her own name. Then she typed the project title, Vanguard Maritime Coordination. Not a reaction, a beginning. 3 weeks after Sloan signed the lease, Julian Sterling still believed the world would keep moving for him. By the 4th month, that belief had become expensive. He stood on a raised platform inside Sterling Maritime's private logistics showroom, surrounded by models of container vessels, aircraft tails, and illuminated shipping lanes that made his empire look smoother than it had ever been in motion. He wore a black wool blazer over a black silk tie, the kind of controlled darkness that photographed as authority. Giselle Croft stood beside him in a pearl-white blouse and ivory trousers, her phone angled low enough to look casual and high enough to capture the room. Behind them, a wall-sized display showed Sterling routes crossing the Atlantic in clean gold lines, none of them marked, with weather exposure, port labor limits, fuel uncertainty, insurance holds, or the human judgment that had always made those routes survive reality. Julian loved that version. It did not ask questions. The investor relations officer introduced him as the man who had transformed maritime movement into luxury precision. Julian accepted the applause with a small nod, as if precision were something he had personally carved from the ocean. Giselle touched his arm at the perfect moment. The cameras caught it. That was the point. In the first row, several investors leaned forward, while a private aviation partner described the next phase: executive cargo priority, premium port access, and a concierge logistics tier for elite clients who wanted the world to move, as if inconvenience were optional. Julian smiled then. He liked that sentence. It sounded like power, without the burden of understanding. When the presentation shifted to routing intelligence, the operations director stepped to the screen and began using phrases Sloan had written years earlier: predictive exposure, multi-port fallback, cold chain priority sequencing, emergency extraction hierarchy. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the last phrase. Not much. Enough. He interrupted before the operations director could continue. Keep it simple, he said. Our clients do not need the plumbing. They need confidence. The room gave him polite laughter. Giselle gave him more than that, a bright approving look designed to reassure him that he was the center, not the system behind him. He needed it. Across town, Sloan watched a replay of the briefing on a muted laptop inside Vanguard Maritime Coordination, not because she missed him, but because arrogance always reveals operational risk when it is allowed to speak in public. She marked 3 moments with a red pen: executive cargo priority, concierge logistics tier, keep it simple. Then she circled the phrase emergency extraction hierarchy and underlined it once. The maritime analyst looked over her shoulder and asked if Sterling still had the original crisis routing dependencies active. Sloan did not look away from the screen. Most of them. The analyst understood the danger before Sloan said another word. A logistics network could survive weather. It could survive delay. It could even survive leadership vanity for a while, if the people underneath kept correcting the map. But Julian was now selling vanity as infrastructure. That made the weakness public. Back in the showroom, a private equity investor raised one hand and asked whether Sterling's routing intelligence remained dependent on its original architecture or had been fully rebuilt after Sloan's departure. The temperature of Julian's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for the people closest to him to feel the draft. He answered with a polished line about institutional knowledge, upgraded teams, and enterprise continuity. He did not say Sloan's name. Giselle shifted beside him, still smiling for the room, but her eyes flicked toward his face, as if she had heard something behind the words. Julian moved on too quickly. That was the tell. Men secure in their own intelligence do not run from the name of the person who made them look brilliant. After the briefing, Julian walked through the reception area, while guests praised the scale of his ambition. He accepted every compliment. He kept Giselle close. He let the cameras record the black suit, and the white silk, and the glowing fleet behind them. On the surface, he looked untouchable. Beneath it, the first hairline fracture had opened. He had built a performance about movement, but the only person who understood the routes was no longer in the room. The first failure looked small enough for Julian to dismiss. A refrigerated container cluster carrying specialty pharmaceuticals missed its protected transfer window in Savannah by 47 minutes, because Sterling Maritime's updated model chose the fastest route instead of the safest one. The operations director flagged it as a priority exposure. Julian called it a weather inconvenience. The second failure arrived before lunch. A West Coast vessel carrying high-value electronics was assigned to a port already backed up by labor restrictions and fuel resupply delays, even though Sloane's old model would have shifted the cargo inland, through a less impressive but more reliable corridor. The clients noticed. They always do. By late afternoon, a Gulf Coast cold chain shipment triggered an insurance review because the routing team could not explain why the system had ignored a temperature risk warning that used to correct itself automatically. The phrase used to became dangerous inside Sterling Maritime. It appeared in emails. It entered meetings. It sat between executives like an accusation nobody wanted to speak aloud. At Vanguard Maritime Coordination, Sloane watched the public port feeds and private client inquiries arrive in separate streams across the west wall. She did not celebrate. She verified. That was her discipline. The maritime analyst tracked congestion pressure. The cold chain reviewer mapped exposure risk. A port scheduling consultant compared Sterling's movements against regional capacity. Sloane stood at the center table with a red pen and marked the pattern as it formed. Julian's company was not failing because she had attacked it. It was failing because it had confused the absence of disaster with the presence of competence. There is a difference. At 6:10 p.m., a former Sterling client contacted Vanguard through a temporary intake portal and asked whether Sloane's new center could provide independent routing assessment without touching proprietary Sterling data. Sloane read the request once. Reply with terms, she said. By 7 p.m., 3 more inquiries arrived. Port operators did not care about glamour when cargo started missing windows. Insurance underwriters did not care about black suits when risk models stopped making sense. Private aviation partners did not care about Giselle's curated travel reels when aircraft sat loaded beside delayed customs clearance. Movement had a language. Julian had never learned it. The next morning, Giselle discovered the turn before Julian admitted it. Her scheduled private transfer from a luxury hotel to a harborside content shoot was delayed, then reassigned, then canceled under corporate transport prioritization. No driver arrived. No VIP lane opened. The concierge gave her a neutral apology and asked if she wanted a standard car service. A standard car service. For Giselle, the humiliation was not the wait. It was the downgrade. She called Julian 4 times before his assistant answered and said he was in an operational review. Giselle looked at the white coat hanging over her arm and the camera team waiting near the lobby doors. For the first time, Sterling Access did not perform. At the executive crisis room, Julian stared at a routing dashboard that no longer behaved like the obedient empire he had sold investors. Red warnings spread across port windows, cold chain corridors, vessel queues, and aircraft cargo transfers. He demanded manual overrides. The operations director explained that manual overrides required confidence in the logic beneath them. Julian asked for the standard model again. No one corrected him aloud. That made it worse. A junior analyst pulled up an old dependency note with Sloane's initials embedded in the architecture history, then quickly minimized it when Julian looked over. Too late. He saw it. His face hardened, but his hand paused on the table. Just paused. In that pause, the room understood what he feared. The system did not miss him when he walked away from the screen, but it had begun to expose the absence of her. By Friday, Sterling Maritime's largest retail client requested an independent routing audit. By Saturday, 2 port authorities demanded clearer priority logic before granting premium slots. By Sunday, a private aviation cargo partner suspended concierge guarantees until Sterling could prove emergency hierarchy compliance. Julian released a statement blaming storm complexity and market volatility. The language sounded expensive. The cargo still did not move. Across town, Sloan approved Vanguard's first formal assessment package and watched a port operator sign the intake terms. No victory speech. No backward glance. She simply drew a red line across a corrected route and said, "Move what matters first." The team adjusted the model. On the screen, one congested corridor cleared. Somewhere inside Sterling Maritime, another executive tried to explain why Julian's empire had everything except the woman, who knew where the pressure would break. By the second Monday, Sterling Maritime did not look ruined from the outside. That was what made the loss of control more brutal. The lobby still shone. The black cars still lined the curb. The reception screens still played silent footage of vessels crossing blue water beneath Julian Sterling's name. But upstairs, movement had become negotiation. Every route required an explanation. Every explanation required data. Every data trail led back to decisions Julian had never learned to make. In the executive crisis room, he stood before a wall of delayed vessels, missed port windows, rerouted aircraft cargo, and suspended premium guarantees, wearing a charcoal executive suit, so perfectly tailored it seemed almost defensive. "Override it," he said. The operations director did not move immediately. That small delay cut deeper than open defiance. "We need verified priority logic before we override," the operations director answered. Neutral, careful, not afraid enough. Julian turned toward the investor relations officer, expecting rescue, but the man lowered his eyes to the tablet and said the largest clients wanted third-party review. The private banker joined by video and used phrases Julian hated: liquidity exposure, confidence interval, reputational pressure, conditional lending review. Nobody accused him. They did not have to. Their restraint was the accusation. Giselle felt the collapse from a different room. She was sitting in an international port lounge in a white cashmere wrap, waiting for a private transfer that had been promised, confirmed, revised, and finally downgraded to commercial availability. Her corporate card declined on an expedited booking because Sterling's travel privileges had been restricted pending operational review. The attendant did not raise her voice. She simply slid the card back and asked whether Giselle had another form of payment. That was enough. Giselle looked toward the glass wall, where cargo trucks moved, without glamour, without captions, without needing her. For the first time, she understood that she had not been attached to a man. She had been attached to access. And access was leaving him first. At Sterling Maritime, the quiet abandonment continued in inches. The executive assistant no longer stood the moment Julian entered. A senior partner, who once laughed at his jokes, took a call in the hallway and did not return. The board representative asked for written documentation instead of accepting his verbal assurance. Even the driver, who had taken Giselle from the tarmac, now waited near the service entrance, with both hands folded, eyes lowered, careful not to be noticed. Julian saw all of it. He saw loyalty converting itself into procedure. He saw admiration turning into risk management. He saw the room measuring him against the system and finding the system missing. His hand tightened around a marker as he faced the dashboard. Red alerts covered the map like a verdict. The Gulf Fleet could not move without verified reroute hierarchy. The Atlantic cargo partners refused premium exposure. The aviation side had suspended high-value transfers after 2 customs timing failures. He demanded Sloan's archived protocols. The compliance officer answered that her authorship logs were under escrow review and could not be used, as if they were anonymous internal property. Anonymous. The word exposed him. For years, Julian had survived by keeping Sloan's genius unnamed, calling it continuity, team process, enterprise intelligence. He had sold himself as the mind and treated her as infrastructure. Now the infrastructure had a name, and the name was not his. The room waited for him to respond. He opened his mouth, then stopped. No polished phrase came fast enough. No luxury image could fill the gap. He looked at the wall of stalled ships and understood the thing he had spent years refusing to know. He had never been afraid Sloan would leave because he loved her too much. He had been afraid she would leave and the world would finally see what stayed behind. By evening, Giselle sent one short message through his assistant instead of calling him directly. She needed space until the situation stabilized. Julian read it twice in the back of a car that was no longer bulletproof, no longer priority, no longer proof of anything. Outside the window, freight trucks passed in steady lines, following routes his empire could not command. He had wanted to decide who got the car. Now he was discovering that the car had never been the road. 4 months after the night on the tarmac, the Global Port Authority hearing began at 9 a.m. In a room built for facts, not charm. No velvet ropes. No champagne. No soft lighting to flatter a black suit. Just a long hearing table, a row of microphones, port officials, insurance representatives, client observers, and a wall display showing vessel delays across 3 coastlines. Julian arrived 10 minutes early, with a folder prepared by people who still worked for him, but no longer sounded certain when they said his name. He looked controlled. That was his last luxury. Sloane entered through the side door wearing a tailored red blazer, over a black blouse, the red flash drive sealed inside a clear evidence sleeve in her portfolio. She did not look at Julian first. She looked at the map. That unsettled him more than anger would have. The Port Authority chair asked Sterling Maritime to explain its priority logic for emergency reroutes, cold chain cargo, and executive transport protocol during the storm window that began the night Sloane left. Julian opened with market language. Severe weather, operational complexity, legacy system transition, temporary volatility. The phrases were expensive and empty. Sloane waited. Then the compliance officer entered the routing dependency chart into the record, along with the Level 0 transport reassignment order, the authorship logs, and the emergency hierarchy Sloane had designed. The room did not turn dramatic. It turned precise. That was worse for Julian. Precision left him nowhere to hide. During the recess, he found her in the corridor outside the hearing room, beside a window overlooking the harbor road. Trucks moved below in clean, practical lines. Julian stood close enough to seem private, but not close enough to risk being overheard by officials. Stabilize the network, he said. For the market. For the clients. Whatever happened between us can be handled separately. Sloane turned her head slowly. Handled separately? He tightened his jaw. You know what I mean. I do. Her voice stayed level. You want the system back, without admitting who built it. Julian lowered his tone, shifting into the voice he used for acquisitions and frightened partners. He offered a title, equity language, public credit, a restored office, a formal statement that would make her return look dignified. He called it resolution. She heard panic dressed as negotiation. This is bigger than you, he said. No, Sloane answered. That was always your mistake. He flinched at the quietness of it. She opened the portfolio and removed one printed routing log. Not a stack. 1 page. Enough. The timestamp showed the vehicle reassignment, the downgrade of her emergency extraction, and the same executive authority chain later used to justify cargo priority choices no trained architect would have approved. She placed it against the window ledge between them. You thought power was deciding who got the car, she said. Power was writing the system that told every car, every ship, and every port where to go. Julian looked at the paper, then at the harbor beyond the glass. For once, he had no room to perform. You left me exposed, he said. Sloane's eye stayed on his. No, I stopped covering what you exposed. The sentence landed, without force, and still changed the air. He tried one more angle, the old one beneath all the others. Sterling Maritime gave you scale. I gave Sterling Maritime movement. She picked up the routing log and returned it to her portfolio. You were the empire. I built the engine. Behind them, the hearing clerk opened the door and called the participants back in. Julian did not move. His hand hovered near his tie, as if straightening it could restore command. Sloane walked past him first. Inside the hearing room, she submitted Vanguard Maritime Coordination's independent assessment. No stolen data, no sabotage, no theatrical revenge, just verified evidence that Sterling's premium network could not safely operate on vanity priority logic. The port officials accepted it into review. Investors took notes. Clients watched Julian instead of waiting for him to lead. He sat at the table in his black suit, surrounded by the vocabulary of a business he owned, but could no longer explain. Sloane did not raise her voice when the chair asked for her recommendation. Separate prestige movement from essential cargo routing, she said. Verify authorship. Protect human risk cargo first, and never let executive ego outrank operational truth. Then she closed the folder. Julian had come to bargain for rescue. He left the corridor having received a diagnosis. True power is not being the passenger in his car. It is owning the road he needs to drive on. There is a kind of freedom that does not announce itself with revenge, applause, or a public collapse. It arrives after the noise has already spent itself. It arrives when a woman no longer needs the person who wounded her to understand the depth of what he lost. Betrayal often wants a witness. It wants the injured person to stay close enough to keep reacting, keep explaining, keep proving her value to someone committed to misunderstanding it. But Sloane had learned something colder and cleaner than revenge. A system that refuses to protect you does not deserve your genius. A man who mistakes your discipline for dependency does not deserve your return. So she did not return. 6 months after the hearing, Vanguard Maritime Coordination occupied the full third floor of the converted freight building by the harbor. The ceiling was still unfinished. The floors were still hard. The freight elevator still opened, with a stubborn delay that made every new client glance up in surprise before stepping inside. Sloane kept it that way. She did not need the room to imitate luxury. She needed it to move the world accurately. Along the west wall, global radar screens tracked vessels, cargo aircraft, port queues, inland rail pressure, cold chain exposure, storm corridors, insurance risk, and humanitarian priority routes in one living field of motion. Red markers did not mean vanity anymore. They meant attention. They meant something had to be protected before profit could flatter itself. Sloane stood at the center console in a red tailored coat, her hair pinned low, a black headset resting near one hand, the red flash drive locked in a transparent case beneath the Vanguard operating charter. The team waited for her call on a southeast port congestion problem affecting medical equipment, refrigerated cargo, and a stalled vessel carrying emergency repair parts. No one asked what would photograph well. No one asked which billionaire wanted priority. They asked what had to move first. That was the difference. Sloane studied the map, checked the weather layer, reviewed the fuel exposure, then drew one red line across the corrected route. Move the medical cargo first, she said. The routing team adjusted. Within seconds, the wall changed. Ships shifted. Aircraft holds updated. Port requests re-ranked. A customs window opened. A rail handoff moved forward. Somewhere far from that room, cargo that mattered began moving again, because the person in charge understood that power was responsibility, not performance. Julian Sterling remained wealthy enough for headlines, but not inevitable enough for trust. Sterling Maritime survived in smaller form, stripped of its premium guarantees, watched by auditors, corrected by clients, and spoken about in the careful language people reserve for men who once seemed larger than their own competence. Giselle Croft moved on to softer sponsors and quieter captions, careful never to mention the port lounge, where borrowed privilege ran out of road. Sloane did not track either of them. She had better maps now. Near dusk, rain began tracing the harbor windows, turning the cranes outside into dark lines against a silver sky. One of the younger analysts asked if she wanted a car brought around before the weather worsened. Sloane looked at the radar wall, then at the street below, where freight trucks moved through the rain in steady order. For a moment, she remembered the private tarmac, the broken badge, the SUV leaving without her. The memory no longer hurt in the same place. It had become data. It had become design. She picked up her red notebook, tucked it under one arm, and walked toward the operations floor instead of the elevator. No, she said. We still have routes to clear. And behind her, on the screens of her own command center, the global lanes kept shifting according to rules she had written, under a name no one could erase. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.